I'd like to welcome you all to the second International Security Speaker Series from the Robert Strauss Center of this spring semester. We have 3 more sessions later in the semester. We actually have an unusually long hiatus, a break between this one and the next one. The next one's not till the end of March. I believe it's March 24th when we'll have Juan Zarate, who is high-level counterterrorism official until 3 weeks ago, and now is, in this golden period between employment. Who knows exactly what he'll do, but I'm sure he will have interesting insights into changes in counterterrorism policy on March 24th here at 5 o'clock. So we're looking forward to that, and I hope to see you there. That's advertising part of the series. But today, we have Steve Schooner, who's a wonderful friend and a very interesting guy, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing his remarks. So Steve is a professor at the George Washington University Law School and an expert on government procurement. He's a law professor, so it's probably not that surprising that he started out as a lawyer. And started out as a lawyer litigating really interesting government procurement cases, and then in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, checking up on federal procurement and thinking about how we should do a better job of organizing our procurement. So he has great stories about, going to Alaska and trying to figure out if set-asides for Alaskan-owned companies are, stealing all the money from taxpayers or only some of the money from taxpayers. So in any event, a font of great stories about how to fix government procurement, and he's been working on that, and he has very creative and insightful ideas about government procurement writ large. He's been the government procurement, I don't have the title right, the journal that you, Public Contract Law Journal, right? So he's one of the editors and founding leading lights in the Public Contract Law Journal for how to study making this process better, or how to write about making this process better of public procurement. But of course, one of the main areas that's kind of pushing the envelope of public procurement issues these days is outsourcing, and especially outsourcing in the area of national security, and the furthest out edge of this, which is questions that have to do with outsourcing of national security on or near the battlefield, and what this means for what kind of shooters are out there, or who's protecting whom, or who's interrogating whom, and under what conditions. There are a whole lot of questions about how to control and orient, how to sort of make policy keep going in the right direction, or be on the up and up in an environment where, for a lot of different reasons, whether it's efficiency or just simple capability or quality, or all these different reasons why we think doing more contracting is also a good idea. So there are lots of trade-offs involved here, and Steve is a wonderful expert on sorting out all these problems, and he's here to share his insights into how the battlefield may have changed, and how we can keep appropriate accountability and oversight in this new contracting environment. So I'm very pleased to introduce Steve Schooner to enlighten us.
I'm assuming I'm going to be loud enough. If in the back at any time I'm not loud enough, just wave at me. First, let me say thanks so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to speak with you. But I also want to indicate from the beginning that I am genuinely a positive and happy person. And you will doubt that by the time I'm done. But as I stand before you today, I have very little good news to offer you whatsoever. So while this may seem incredibly pessimistic, I apologize for that, but I think that it reflects the times and some of the decisions that have been made. But once again, a real pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure. I was an undergraduate at Rice University, and I've been on this campus a number of times, many decades ago, but just a funny little tidbit, apropos of absolutely nothing. In college, for a number of bizarre reasons, I ended up being a varsity cheerleader, and the first game that I ever cheered at was actually in the stadium here in Austin. So it's always a pleasure to come back here and think about myself in a totally different context. Okay. Enough about Bevo. Okay, so let's talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'll go back and forth in a number of different directions about how the government buys, what that means. But in terms of what the public knows and what the public thinks about, the debate has changed dramatically, and people's perspectives are very heavily informed by what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. So let me start with the first and simplest statistic, which still is shocking to those of us who consider ourselves in the expert class and unnerving to people who haven't necessarily thought about it. But in Iraq today, we have more contractors supporting the military than we have members of the military. From a conceptual standpoint, this is unprecedented. We did something a little bit like this in Bosnia, but obviously that was a much smaller scale. But much of what happens is just that we have this massive contractor population in what is, in effect, first a battle area, but also reasonably modern in that as a former military officer, it's very different than the battlefield I learned about. There's no clear lines. It's a disaggregated or a disorienting type of fluid place, but we have lots and lots of contractors in what is in effect a dangerous and unhappy place. There's any number of unresolved policy issues. Let me also tell you about what I'm going to do for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to talk really, really fast, first because I like to, and second because there's lots of important things to think about. My understanding is that what you want to hear from me is some ideas, and then we can have a nice interchange later. But some of the things that I'll be talking about that'll come up time and time again, and we can investigate later if you'd like, are actually what are the contractors' roles and limits. The one that I think is very interesting to start with. When I was a junior Army officer, there were really only two rules that you had to know about contractors. First, the government never relied on contractors to the extent that it couldn't fight without them, because remember, the contractors can always go home. And the second was that the contractors do not engage the enemy in combat. These two fundamental doctrinal lines don't really exist in Iraq and Afghanistan anymore, and we can look more at that a little bit later. One of the most confusing things that most people don't necessarily think about is command and control in the battle area with this massive contractor preference. I make reference to the fact that there are two COs. In the military context, we think of the CO as the commanding officer. In my little geek world, when we say CO, we're talking about the contracting officer, the individual who has the authority to bind the government in contract and is the only one who can really tell the contractor what to do. So keep in mind, in the battle area, where the commanding officer is the Lord High Emperor, the commanding officer does not really control the contractor who reports to and is driven by the contracting officer. We could have a lot of fun and we could speak for weeks about contractors under the Geneva Convention. Keep it in the back of your mind. We haven't really got those policies worked out yet. But the other one that's fascinating is profit and incentive schemes. And I'll come back to this at various times, but keep in mind that people don't join the military for the same reason that they work for contractors, and military organizations don't respond to and pursue their aims for the same reason that profit-seeking corporations do. And I don't want to make a qualitative judgment on that yet, just to point out that it's fundamentally different. All right. One of the big news stories that probably isn't even on your radar yet, but you might want to keep in the back of your mind because they give us a helpful rubric. A couple of senators, a little over a year ago, created a new wartime contracting commission. And this wartime contracting commission is inspired by the work of the Truman Committee. Many of you may know that Truman's first appearance on the cover of Time magazine was actually when he was holding hearings about contractors. This new effort is basically an outgrowth of the level of frustration by Congress with the fact that nothing but bad news comes out of Iraq with regard to contractors. And there's any number of issues that we can talk about that, but let me just offer one helpful rubric that comes from this group. When I say contractors in the battle area, I'm talking about a number of different things. And so let me just suggest three basic food groups for you to think about as we talk about this. Each of them are doing different things. They happen to overlap a little bit, but it's really important to keep them organized. And as a general rule, Congress doesn't do a very good job keeping them organized, but the Commission treats them differently in terms of their statutory mandate. The first group is what we're going to call logistics and support. And for your purposes, most of you will equate that to Kellogg, Brown and Root, or Halliburton. In Iraq and Afghanistan, and basically everywhere the military goes today, we have a logistics contractor, and I'll come back to the log cap contract in just a moment, but they're responsible for basic creature comforts for our military. If you grew up in the military and you're familiar with the concept of KP and all those kinds of, forget that stuff. All that's done by contractors today. And this is a massive multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The next story, which was also going on in Iraq, to some extent unprecedented, was a high-level political decision was made that we were going to rebuild Iraq. We were going to do it in rather dramatic fashion. We were going to do it incredibly quickly. And in retrospect, we weren't going to wait until the country was stabilized. I'll come back to some problems with that. But as a matter of fact, we had staggering numbers of contractors in Iraq trying to rebuild infrastructure while we were still suppressing a military problem. And then the other, and this is actually of these groups by far and away the smallest group, but also the most controversial, what I'll call arms-bearing contractors. Many of you may call private security, and the cynics in the room will simply call them mercenaries. All right? Yes?
Can I ask one clarifying question?
Please.
Are you speaking of the entire population of contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, no matter which federal agency employs them, or just those employed by the Department?
Tremendously important question, okay? The short answer is I'm trying to describe the broad-based contractor population in this expanded battle area, and many, if not most of the contractors do not necessarily work for the Army or other defense agencies. So for example, the logistics contract is an Army contract, but it services other military organizations. Reconstruction, that train is driven primarily by the Agency for International Development. When we get to arms-bearing contractors, this is where it really gets interesting. They're working for everybody. Some of them work for the Army, some of them work for the Agency for International Development. A lot of them work for the State Department, that's going to be Blackwater, but the largest population of the arms-bearing contractors aren't working for any of those agencies. They're subcontractors working for example, the contractors that are doing reconstruction because the United States government couldn't protect them in the first place. So very, very highly disaggregated, and this goes back to the point earlier. The commanding officer, the military officer in charge of Iraq, not only doesn't have power over the Army's contractors, he or she surely has no power over the State Department's contractors or AID's contractors. And we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit later about Blackwater. Okay, so just some pervasive themes to keep in the back of your mind as I keep throwing things at you. The outsourcing trend, I'm going to talk about this quite a bit. The government did not get to where we are in Iraq and Afghanistan today through the process of contemplation, research, study, and decision making. We got there by happenstance. There are massive outsourcing trends that you're familiar with. The government has been subjected to them, but realistically, with very, very few exceptions, most of the times that we have contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, these weren't big, large-scale policy decisions that were made. They were decisions that were made in the breach. The biggest example of that is log cap. I'll come back to that too. The accountability vacuum. The reason that you hear about contractors, and it's on the front page of your newspapers all the time, is because, frankly, there have been problems. And there's totally different kinds of problems, but the two basic food groups here that I think are helpful, on the one hand, you have huge numbers of people, 200,000 people in a really bad area, crimes get committed. Very difficult to prosecute the contractors. That's one issue. And then the other is, anytime a government spends, let's say, hundreds of billions of dollars, the potential for waste or inefficient spending is very high. Both of these problems come up all the time. The underlying story for all of this throughout Iraq, and I can basically take you there from any individual contract, is speed and aggression were far more important than planning or staffing at the highest levels of the decision-making apparatus in the Defense Department and the White House. So the bottom line is we rushed, we were aggressive, we wanted to do very, very dramatic things, but if you think about structuring contracts, Very, very difficult to get value for your money on a bargain when you don't know what you want at the time you enter into the bargain. So overall, very difficult to show that we got excellent value for money in Iraq. Customer satisfaction, highly variable, sometimes terrifically high, sometimes very low. Our policy aims were definitely conflicted by poorly crafted contracts, and the public trust, I think, has been harmed rather dramatically. But one of the outcomes of this, and this is something as a procurement person that I find extremely disconcerting, is the overall level of anti-contractor rhetoric. The, frankly, anti-contractor resentment is at a fever pitch now in the country. You could walk the halls of Congress, and contractors and members of Congress don't know anything about procurement, but they know they don't like contractors. And they know they want to punish them, and they know they don't want them making a lot of profits. And at the end of the day, it's uninformed, and frankly, in the truest sense of the form, it's fundamentally ignorant, but it's very, very frustrating. For our government to be so reliant on contractors today and to not appreciate, but more importantly, despise them, puts us in a little bit of a hypocritical situation. Our military can't fight without the contractors. At some level, they're providing staggeringly high levels of support, but we will not defend our contractors in the court of public opinion, and we treat them like garbage, which is potentially problematic, but I'll come back to that as well. Okay, so you open up your newspapers, and one of the big stories you hear is that we spent lots and lots of money rebuilding Iraq, and we didn't do a very good job. True. If you ever are really interested in these issues, the best source of reading on this is the SIGIR, or the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. He does wonderfully quarterly reports. He testifies in front of Congress all the time. He also has some wonderful lessons learned documents on the contracting process. There are a couple things that Stu Bowen says time and time again. First, for all the stuff in the newspapers that you read about the actual fraud in Iraq, it's infinitesimally low, and pretty much rounding errors is the best you're going to get to. Overall, the real problems with contracting on the reconstruction side were overly ambitious programs, failure to plan, and failure to staff, and I'll come back to that as well. And here's just one of my favorite examples. Parsons Bechtel had a multi-billion-dollar capital reconstruction contract. Among other things, they were only supposed to build about 450 healthcare units around an area about the size of Texas. These were design-build projects where they were basically supposed to design the things and build them and get it done reasonably quickly while people were shooting at them. By the same token, the United States government gave them no defensive support whatsoever. They had to use contractors to do that. And by the time they left, they had spent about 50 cents on every dollar they spent just on private security. But interestingly enough, the customer, the Agency for International Development, which was way over its head when it got the tasking in the first place, didn't really staff the effort. Again, 450 healthcare units all over Iraq. AID had about 6 people managing that contract, and most of them were not in the country. It's not the way you would manage your construction projects, and so it's not surprising that the contractor ran into difficulties. All right, so let's come to the present day and talk about outsourcing at a larger level. We have a new president. The new president has a lot of problems to deal with. Some of you may have noticed we have some economic issues today. In addition to that, there are a number of campaign issues that were addressed. Consistent with what Hillary Clinton did as well, the president ran on, in small part, an anti-contractor agenda. If you go to whitehouse.gov today, you can read the same rhetoric that you found on change.org. And what it basically says, among other things, is that we need fewer contractors and we can't rely on them too much. But here's the interesting thing. He wanted to eliminate the ideological bias towards outsourcing. It is true, by the way, that President Bush very strongly did favor outsourcing, but I'll come back to that in a second. But strong rhetoric saying outsourcing is, in and of itself, a potential negative. All right? Concerned about the rising number of government contractors. This is a fascinating topic, and if you're interested in this one, the author I recommend most is Paul Light, who used to be at Brookings and is now up at NYU. He writes about the true size in government. An interesting topic that you might want to think about is both sides of the aisle like to talk about how small government is, but I think that anybody who studies government knows that government isn't smaller today. We just have fewer civil servants and fewer members of the military. The mandates grow. We need more people to do the work. That's contractors. And then, of course, the other fascinating issue is that the president claims he's going to basically have contractors performing fewer inherently governmental functions. It's a good aim, and hopefully we'll get there as well. But there's a little bit of a problem with this as a campaign or a goal. Well, the first thing is this ideological bias is totally bipartisan and isn't just a Bush administration construct. In fact, at a minimum, it spans the last 16 years and frankly goes back much further. But for those of you who are familiar with Vice President Al Gore's National Performance Review, very, very focused on having the government act more commercial-like, and outsourcing was a big theme in that. But whether we like it or not, it's simply disingenuous to say that the last administration favored outsourcing any more than the prior administration. We're talking a major generational trend. Everybody, Democrats, Republicans, likes to tell the public that government is smaller, but it's not smaller. We know the mandates have grown. Contractors are doing more work. Let's just talk about money for a little bit here. All right, now, these numbers here, just put little B's after them. We're talking about billions of dollars annually. How much stuff does the government buy? And when I talk about things the government buys, we're buying supplies or hardware, construction, things that are built, improvements to real property, and services. Interestingly enough, when I came into the field, the government primarily bought hardware, bought a little bit of construction, and very, very little services. That's totally flipped. Today, the government is primarily a services consumer, buys a fair amount of hardware, less construction. But here's what I want you to think about. Since 2000, federal purchasing annually has gone from the very low 200s to an excess of $500 billion. Sure.
Is this just DOD figures or is this federal aggregate?
Okay, this is federal, okay? So DOD tends to account for 60 to 65% of this. And interestingly enough, even with what we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, DOD's percentage of the federal procurement budget doesn't really change that dramatically, but somewhere in the 2/3 range. Now, you might look at that chart and say, well, you know, how dramatically different is that from just inflation? Obviously, the government's going to spend a little bit more each year, right? Well, let's look at it. The yellow bars are the increases in the consumer price index in this decade. And I've been rather generous for 2008. We know that's coming down, okay? But realistically, no matter how you count this, federal procurement spending has increased at a minimum 5 times the rate of inflation in this decade. That's pretty dramatic stuff. The government's buying more stuff. The interesting thing in this decade, most of that addition is in services. What that means is the government has promised to the taxpayers it's going to do more things. It doesn't have enough civil servants. It doesn't have a big enough military. So it does what we call employee augmentation. They hire contractors to come in and perform the tasks that would have been done by members of or employees of the federal government a number of years before. But this is a pretty important theme, how dramatically spending has increased in this decade. And keep in mind, this is in some ways reflective of, but separate and apart from what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. The main reason I want to make this point to you is everything that's going wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the exception of the shooting, is also going wrong in the federal procurement system across the government. All of the other agencies have the same problems. And the scariest thing is if you take NASA out of the equation, the Defense Department typically does better at procurement than most other agencies. So it's a pretty scary picture if you think about it that way. All right, let me talk about some outsourcing examples just to kind of build the context for you. Anybody here heard of the NMCI, the Navy Marine Corps Intranet? Good, at least some of you. This is the largest seat management contract of its type. Basically, the Navy and the Marine Corps decided they were just going to get out of the IT business. So instead of buying mainframes and buying desktop PCs and buying laptops and buying software and having people run help desks, they went to EDS, they did it competitively, and they said, look, I got a few 100,000 people, they work all over the world, they do all kinds of things. I want them to have whatever they need in terms of IT. and I'm willing to pay you per head or per seat per month for them to have the IT they need. So the Navy and the Marine Corps, they don't own any more hardware. They don't have anybody who does information technology, but they basically rent information technology hardware and software each month for everybody in the Navy and the Marine Corps around the world. The second generation of this contract is about to come out. Just to put it in scale, the original estimates on this was going to be something in the $9 billion range. Ended up a little bit closer to $18 billion, but we're talking pretty large-scale outsourcing. All right, the log cap contract. Sure.
Just one little note on that I just saw an article that came out on NMCI that they're now going to what they call next gen, and they're going to take back more of those assets. So I think the Navy has learned that lesson, and now they're going to be not using this same model. They're going to actually start building and maintaining their own infrastructure and their own hardware as well.
Right, and the other interesting thing is there are some things that they thought would be at NMCI who have gone in and come out. But it's been a fascinating evolution. This is one of those things, like so many government contracts, there's a lot of stuff on the web, but if you could read GAO reports on this till the cows come home, very, very heavily studied, in part because it was very different, very aggressive, but another terrific example of a reasonably successful model. Plenty of firms outsource their human resources. Plenty of small businesses outsource their information technology. But for the Navy to take the position that, you know what, why don't we just outsource everything and let's do it now, that's the kind of aggression and, as some might say, fiscal irresponsibility that leads to some of the problems. Fascinating idea. Maybe it should have been done in stages. Maybe it should have evolved a little bit. Okay, so the log cap contract. The log cap contract is the logistics civil augmentation program. This is the way that our military is supported abroad. Now, interestingly enough, if you were in the military, if you grew up in the military, if you watch the old movies, everybody went to basic training, and then some people became cooks, and some people did laundry, and some people took care of other stuff. A decision was made a number of years ago when the military was being drawn down after the wall comes down. We're trying to actually save the peace dividend. A decision was made that the military was going to change its tooth-to-tail ratio. So if the military was going to be smaller, the military wanted more trigger pullers and, for example, less cooks, less whatever. Pick whatever your category is. The original log cap contract was reasonably small in scale, and the theory is wherever the military goes, the contractor will come and support them and take care of their needs. Nobody ever anticipated it operating on the scale it has in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, interestingly enough, KBR originally had the contract. There was another competition. DynCorp got part of it, and then KBR ended up getting it back. And they got it back because this contractor has tremendously high levels of customer satisfaction with the military. Here's what I think may be the most outrageous thing I'll say this afternoon, but you can decide for yourselves. I believe that a generation from now, military history will look back and reflect upon this and suggest that it's possible that the log cap contract is the single most significant advancement in military history of the modern era. I think it's going to be more dramatic than unmanned aerial vehicles and drones. When it's all said and done, never before in the history of the world has a nation been able to project such military power around the world and have it so well supported. We can sustain our military faster and better than we ever have before. And all you ever need to do, just grab any mid-career military officer, particularly someone who went over to the Persian Gulf in Desert Shield or Desert Storm and lived in a tent and ate meals ready to eat and basically lived like an animal for a number of months, and compare their experience to the troops that we send over to Iraq and Afghanistan today, who get at least one hot meal a day, some get 3, they get hot showers, they wear clean laundry and the like. And think about it as a commander. If you want your military force to be rested, focused, and frankly, potent as a fighting force, would you rather them be rested, well-fed, well-clothed, and the like? Never before has any military been supported the way we are now. Now, let's be honest. Anytime you have a multi-billion-dollar contract in a battle area, and the unequivocal guidance to the contractor is, I don't really care about the marginal dollar. I want things when I ask for them, and quality is far more important than price. You're going to get the kind of stories you read about in the newspaper. When KBR is out in the marketplace trying to buy fuel, they are far more concerned about making sure the supply line doesn't stop than they are about saving the marginal penny. This drives Congress crazy. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Also, anytime you have a lot of people in a bad area like this, mistakes will be made. People do bad things. Sure.
What's the timeline on log cap and kind of the evolution of this?
We are currently in the third generation of log cap. This greatly precedes Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not sure exactly when the first one is, but we're going back into the 90s on the log cap vehicle.
And is this cost plus as well?
Yeah, so the general vehicle on this, it's cost plus, and it's more cost plus award fee today than it is cost plus a fixed fee, but we can unpack that a little bit later. Interestingly enough, going back to campaign promises and the like, pretty much all of the candidates for the presidency of this nation are opposed to cost reimbursement contracts. Everybody thinks cost reimbursement contracts are the worst thing in the world. Now, let's think for just a second. The alternative to a cost reimbursement contract is a fixed price contract. Now, when one of you comes up with a solution for how we could price these services on a fixed price basis, please let me know. The bargain between the Army and the contractor is, I'm not going to tell you in advance how many people I'm sending, I'm not going to tell you where I'm sending them, and I'm not going to tell you how long we're going to stay there, okay? But you will support me anywhere I go on the planet. The deal, the bargain is, the contractor is reimbursed for their out-of-cost expenses, out-of-pocket expenses to provide the services, and then they get, frankly, a rather small profit, often in the 2% range, and sometimes they lose money. But at the end of the day, in a fixed price vehicle for this type of work, there's literally no way to estimate it. There's no metric upon which the contractor could come up with a fixed price for this level of service that wouldn't be totally extraordinary. But we should talk more about cost reimbursement contracts later. Okay, but now let's talk about outsourcing. The big one is private security. Why is it in this room that most of you no longer recoil when you see the mall cop? You don't think anything is you, and you walk around a college campus and you see private security, but in your heart of hearts, you don't like the idea of those mercenaries. Now let me tell you, I'm no fan of private security, but I want you to try to think through the process. The overall outsourcing trend of private security isn't something the military started. And particularly the United States military is very late to the game. The question, though, is what are the limits and how should it be constrained? Now, there was some great correspondence written in the last few years by some pretty thoughtful people. The reasonably new Secretary of Defense sent a letter over to the Joint Chiefs. He asked some pretty good questions. Why is it that we've come to rely on private contractors to provide training for our forces? Do we fully understand the implications of what this means? Now, the answer, why did we do this? Because we don't have enough people to get our jobs done. But what are the long-term implications? Great question. Similar question comes from a couple of senators to then Secretary of State Rice. The original letter comes with the announcement, and this is going back a few months, when Blackwater said they were going to get out of the private security business and they were going to go back just to training. The question is, gee whiz, you told us, State Department, that you couldn't stay in Iraq if you didn't have private security. What's your plan if Blackwater actually leaves? What is the overall cost-benefit analysis of relying so heavily on private security? I'll come back to Blackwater at a couple different points, but one important thing to keep in mind. Most people have in their mind that Blackwater was a reasonably new contractor working for us in Iraq, or this was a new relationship with the State Department. We have something called the WPPS, the Worldwide Personal Protective Services Contract. State Department has private security all over the world. You walk into an embassy, you see a couple good-looking Marines looking really good in their uniforms. They're all for show. They're not providing security. The contractors are providing security at all the embassies around the world. Okay, so let's talk for just a moment about why agencies outsource in the first place. Now, a lot of this stuff, you can come up with your own conclusions. These are not necessarily the end-all, be-all, but for most organizations, The biggest reason to outsource is you need additional tasks completed, and you want to focus on what you're good at, and so you're going to bring in other people who are good at those tasks to do them for you. Another great reason for outsourcing, and this is really important, is whatever the size of your organization is, the great thing about the private sector is it's almost unlimited. Whatever you need more of, somebody's got it available. And think about this just in terms of the military for a second. Growing the military takes a lot of time, a lot of investment, a lot of training. But anything that the military needs a little of, you can always get it from the private sector. Surge capacity, whether it's transportation, people, expertise, anything, there's just wonderful capacity in the private sector. Flexibility, wonderful to be able to use any firms you want to do so. Sometimes organizations want people who are thinking differently from they are, and they get a little bit of cross-fertilization. But the big issues when we think about the United States government today and why they outsource so much, and this is very, very important, is that if you're trying to actually perform a mission for the government, one of the problems you have today is your organization isn't big enough to get the work done, and a lot of people aren't very happy with the long-term established employee base that the government has. So first, your office is limited often by Congress. You can't grow, so you go out and get outside help. In addition, what a lot of program managers find is that when they say to their employees, I need you to stay a little bit late tonight, I need you to work over the weekend, I need you to get with the team, this is really important, they basically work to the rule. It's kind of almost like a union type approach in its most pejorative type approach, whereas contractors often will do whatever you ask them to do because remember, they're in the business of making profit, they're trying to make their customer happy. But at the end of the day, almost all the surveys that have been done is program managers love contractors because they're not civil servants. They can fire them, they can discipline them, and they can also incentivize them in a positive way. You can offer them a bonus. If you do this, I'll give you a lot more money. All the things you can't do with federal government employees. But at the end of the day, the big question still remains, how do we expect a military to fight all over the world when it's not big enough? How do we expect a government to provide for services that it's understaffed to provide? And that's why we outsource so much today. Okay, here's the key point. If you're about to take your early evening nap and you don't remember anything else I tell you, what you need to remember is that most organizations do not outsource just to save the marginal dollar. If Congress understood this, we would be in a very different world. Frankly, most members of Congress, when they think about government contracting and outsourcing, all they want to know is, did it save a penny? Did it save money? There's a wonderful study by Rand from 2000 which basically lays out no one has ever demonstrated that outsourcing saves the government money anywhere, ever. It's never been demonstrated. And one of the reasons is the targets change a little bit. So it's not about saving the money, but one of the great things to keep in mind is sometimes, as consumers, you might be willing to pay more for higher quality goods or services, faster response times, unlimited surge capacity, flexibility, or the like. Just like you sometimes are willing to pay more for better service, the government should be willing to do so also, but Congress hasn't quite internalized that concept yet. Now, having said that, let's be honest. Outsourcing is not a panacea, and it is highly risky for a number of different reasons. First of all, there are some things that your contractors simply shouldn't perform, and I'm going to use the proxy now. We have a definition of inherently governmental functions. Contractors aren't supposed to perform inherently governmental functions. It's a shame today that they do, and we can unpack that later if we have some time. Basically, we want government employees making discretionary decisions and taking actions that directly impact taxpayers and other parties. We shouldn't have contractors doing that. It happens a lot. Another problem that we have today is because we have so heavily integrated contractors into the workforce, we have what we call a blended workforce, but the government ethics rules weren't written for that environment. So you have a government employee doing the same job and sitting next to a contractor employee, but the contractor employee can take the $100 ticket for the sporting event that night, and the government employee can't. These lead to individual tensions. Small example, but the biggest problem that we have is if you go through the ranks of the senior management of the government, this is true in the military and the civil service, nobody was ever trained to manage a blended workforce. And that's a huge problem across the board. Think about it in Iraq, 50-50 military to contractors. And at the end of the day, here's the real hole. It's one thing to outsource to contractors, but you still have to manage them. Two quick examples. How many of you would be willing to hire a nanny to take care of your child? That's a classic outsourcing solution. But then after you hired the nanny, never speak to her again. Most of you would be inclined to interact with the nanny on a regular basis. How many of you would be inclined to have your kitchen or your bathroom in your home renovated and do that while you were out of the country for a number of months and never see the contractor do their work? You would consider this irrational behavior. That's what we have done far too often in the federal government. All right, so let's go back then just for a second and talk about outsourcing and get some reactions using Blackwater as a proxy. I love doing this in different kinds of groups just to kind of see people's reactions. I want a little bit of show of hands action as we go through the list. When you hear the word Blackwater, how many of you think profiteers? Anybody? Mercenaries? Cowboys? Okay, how about the military commander's worst nightmare? Okay, if you've been in the military, it's got to scare you, right? How about a political or a foreign relations accident waiting to happen? Wait, too late, it already did. Okay, let's go to the other side. When you hear Blackwater, how many of you think this is an essential element to the United States military and diplomatic presence in Iraq? State Department's on record. They cannot be in the country without them. How many of you think patriots? How many of you know or have internalized that all of the shooters in the September incident were either former military or former police officers? Realize that the original security delegation that Blackwater used to protect Ambassador Bremer, all of those people were either former Navy SEALs or Special Forces soldiers. How many of you think public servants when you hear Blackwater? I got at least a couple back there. Best private security money can buy? Okay. And how about the future? And that's the really scary part. Okay. This is where we are today. Now, many of you know that Iraq has finally put their foot down and they have said, Blackwater can't have a business license anymore, they have to leave. Sounds really terrible. What's the catch there? Anybody read the story closely? All the people working for Blackwater will go and work for one of the competitors because that's okay. Under the WPPS contract, there's multiple contractors anyway. They just move within themselves anyway. But at the end of the day, no dramatic differences there. But this contrast, the juxtaposition, the public per se thinks mercenaries first, profiteers, and that's a little bit disturbing. Now, here's the other thing I want you to think about. I shouldn't leave this one too quickly. When they were hired, the people Blackwater was providing were indeed the best private security money could buy. Here's the scary thing. Very difficult to count contractors in Iraq. We're not sure how many are bearing arms. But one of the interesting things is as we've increased the numbers from 5 and then 10 and then 15, maybe as many as 30,000 arms-bearing contractors in Iraq, the scariest thing is the thinning of the gene pool. When you hire Blackwater because they've only got former Navy SEALs and Special Forces soldiers, you're hiring elite people with experience. But after you've hired all of them, you immediately start encouraging people to leave active duty. That's a bummer. You increase the bonuses, that doesn't work, you keep doing that. But then you keep hiring. My favorite is from when my friends have come back from Iraq and they describe the dining facilities as being akin to the cantina scene in the Star Wars movies, where you have people from many, many nations, many who can't speak to each other, many who don't like each other, and at the end of the day, we're not really sure who they're going to start shooting at when the shooting starts. And that's basically what's happened, because remember, some of the military, private security are working for the military, many for the State Department, many AID, but the largest share are working for the contractors supporting other government initiatives. All right. The other thing that we read about in the newspaper all the time is the accountability debacle, the vacuum, or whatever. Let's start just for a second with the criminal law aspect of it. Now, again, as Gene mentioned earlier, I'm kind of an attorney, so this is pretty important to me. We'll leave the policy for just a second, but let me start with my favorite anecdote. let's take a not so small town, something bigger than Waco, okay, but not too big. Not as big as Austin, but bigger than Waco. What if I told you that in my town of over 150,000 people, the average age of my residents were between 18 and 35? And in addition, not only was the average age of my resident between 18 and 35, but they were primarily male, and most of them, by definition, were willing to take risks and go to dangerous places. Okay? And then what if I told you that for a 3-year period in my town of 150,000 risk-taking guys between the ages of 18 and 35, I told you that there had not been one crime prosecuted? Your gut would either be that that's utopia or something's really, really wrong. Well, that's what we had in Iraq. No prosecutions of contractors at all for years on end. We finally turned that tide, but let's start with how we got there. The solution for maintaining order in the battle area is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Just one small problem. The Uniform Code of Military Justice covers everybody in the battle area associated with the military force as long as Congress declares war. But Congress stopped declaring war before most of the students in the room were born, right? We don't declare war anymore for all kinds of reasons. So the fundamental tool for having contractors covered in the battle area didn't work because the UCMJ didn't apply to them. So Congress reacted with something called the MIJA, the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. The original one wasn't written very well, but that was intended to cover defense contractors. You may know where I'm coming. I'll come back to that in just a second. But we first realized there was a real big problem there when we found out there were contractor interrogators in Abu Ghraib. Now, they were obviously working for the Army, but interestingly enough, they had been hired under a Department of Interior contract for information technology services. Don't think about it too much. It'll give you a headache. But if you really want to keep going down that line, you might want to be curious to know that at Gitmo, the same contractors doing the same things, they had been hired under a GSA contract also for information services. Don't think about it too much. MIJA has been amended. The UCMJ has been amended. We're closing these loopholes very, very quickly, but we had some massive accountability problems. Frankly, it was the Wild West. The other fun one are we have these SOFAs, Status of Forces Agreements. We always negotiate SOFAs in situations like this, and the original SOFA that was negotiated, the original, I believe it was Coalition Provisional Authority Order number 17, specifically said that our contractors would not be subject to Iraqi law, right? Of course, no contractors going into Iraq to be covered by Iraqi law, particularly when we first asked them to go there. I'll come back to that as we get towards the end because that's a new problem as well. Realistically, though, for most of the time that we have been in Iraq, contractors could, in fact, commit crimes, and it was unclear who, if anyone, could investigate and prosecute those crimes. A little bit easier to deal with today, still not fully worked out. All right, this brings us to the Blackwater indictment. As most of you know, Blackwater, the shooters are in fact being prosecuted today, but they are being prosecuted under the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. The indictment specifically alleges, and in order for the prosecution to succeed, the judge must find that the security contractors who were in that square that day were supporting the Defense Department mission. As an attorney, as someone who is in this field, this is fundamentally wrong. All right? First, the contractors who were working for Blackwater did not believe they were working for the Defense Department. Their contract was with the State Department. Even more specifically, nobody at the State Department believed that those contractors were working for the Defense Department either. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. The judge may want to keep jurisdiction just because. The Justice Department does indeed want to make an example out of Blackwater. The behavior may in fact have been totally outrageous. But the jurisdictional hook is a broken one and is going to lead to more problems later. If you actually read the briefs in the case, the contractors' briefs make a lot more sense than the government's. All right, but to show you how far we've come, this is a solicitation. This comes from something called fedbizops.gov. federalbusinessopportunities.gov. It's the place where the government advertises for contractors when they need them. This is actually a fascinating one. It's been up for a couple of months now, originally up in mid-December. The United States Army is looking for a contractor to go to Afghanistan to keep track of arms-bearing contractors in Afghanistan. Now, here's some interesting things about this. Right before this came out, the Defense Department said that we shouldn't have contractors managing arms-bearing contractors, and they're right. Having said that, what the Army figured out was they probably should have kept track of their contractors in Iraq when they were there, and they definitely should have kept track of the arms-bearing contractors, and they didn't do a very good job. So, on the one hand, it's not perfect to have contractors managing contractors, but it's a lot better that we have a plan, at least, in Afghanistan, where we had no plan or infrastructure to do so in Iraq. There's a couple fascinating things about this if you get interested in it. This is, interestingly enough, a fixed price contract. It has been described as a commercial contract, and it's being awarded under the simplified acquisition procedures, which is really kind of bizarre if you think about it. Most people who have read the solicitation believe it's a wire job. They've already got the contractor picked out. But it's wonderful reading if you ever get a chance to look at it. My favorite part of the solicitation is it includes the site visit solicitation provision, which basically says, like it in almost all government contracts, you should go take a look where the contract's going to be performed to make sure you understand the lay of the land before you get there. This is, again, for a simplified acquisition that's a commercial contract. I think that you've either been to Afghanistan to this point or you haven't. All right, now, big picture. How did we get into this problem, and why are we not getting out of it anytime soon? This is a classic case somewhere between diffusion of responsibility and an abject failure of leadership and fiscal stewardship. I want to just pose to you a couple trends, one that I've already introduced. I've already suggested to you that in this decade, federal procurement spending has gone through the roof, and a lot of that has been services. But here's the thing that I really want to give you, just so I can make sure that I ruin your day looking forward. For a million bad reasons, from 1989 until 2000, Congress mandated every year that the Defense Department had to cut the acquisition workforce. Again, think tooth to tail. Fewer shoppers, more trigger pullers. No empirical evidence supported the cuts. No economic evidence suggested that the government could manage the contracts with fewer people, but the Defense Department kept cutting because they had to draw down the size of the military. Now, how dramatic would that trend be? Well, interestingly enough, this is what we call the Gensler Commission, but this came out in October of 2007, and I love to use this report as an example because everything that I've ever read about drug addiction and alcohol addiction is that you can't begin to get better until you acknowledge you have a problem. This is the first serious government report that acknowledges that the government has a really big problem with its acquisition workforce. Here's one of my favorite quotes from it. All right, I need you to think for just a second. The Gensler Commission uses the word contract management. When we say contract management, after the contract is awarded, who manages the contract? That's what we're talking about. So what does Gensler say? Well, you need contract management to ensure that the mission gets accomplished and to control fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a given. Everybody accepts it. But what does the study show? Well, we don't have enough administrative contracting officers. So the government writ large doesn't have enough people left to manage contractors. Now, what they say is the PCOs, the purchasing or the procuring contracting officers, the people who award the contracts could manage the contractors after the contracts get awarded, but, oh, well, they're too busy. So the work just doesn't get done. So across the government, we're awarding hundreds of billions of dollars in contracts, and there's nobody there to manage them. How dramatic is this? Just a nifty little chart. When you look at this white line, this is reflective of the charts I showed you earlier. We're basically seeing the fall of the East, and then, or the walls coming down. Right about 2000, federal procurement spending stabilizes briefly, and then in this decade, federal procurement spending goes through the roof. Now, I'm only using DoD figures here. 1989 to 2000, Congress is cutting the acquisition workforce because they want more trigger pullers and fewer shoppers. But even though the spending keeps going up, no reaction. And so my favorite one, there was a study that just came out a couple weeks ago. DoD procurement itself basically went up more than 100% in this decade, and the Defense Department has a total of 25 more contract specialists today than they had in 2000. So they only have a couple, a few $100 billion more to manage and a couple handful more people. This is where the big vacuum lies. All right, here's the other thing. It's not just that we don't have enough people. In addition to everything else, we got the wrong people. The government hasn't hired aggressively acquisition professionals since the 1980s. Well, here's the funny thing. In the 1980s, we bought primarily hardware. Today, we buy services. Back then, we used to award contracts based on low price wins. We used firm fixed price contracts. And at the end of the day, we had this massive contract management organization for the Defense Department. Today, all of the vehicles have changed. And at the end of the day, most of what we're hiring is personal services. And we don't have anybody left to manage them. So in addition to everything else, our most senior people were never trained to manage service contractors anyway. So it's a little bit of a problem. Now, let me throw in a couple other things before I wrap up. One of the things that I find particularly troubling about the anti-contractor sentiment and the fact that all you hear about is contractors making mistakes, spending too much money, and committing crimes in Iraq, all of which may in fact be true, we have seen a fascinating development in terms of how we think about our government in a representative democracy. I wrote this article called Why Contractor Fatalities Matter, because my experience is, and here's my assignment to all of you, go home, ask your spouses, ask your kids, ask your friends, ask your neighbors. Most people you talk to believe that contractor life is less valuable than military life. Most people, in fact, will often give you the knee-jerk reaction when a contractor's killed in Iraq, they had it coming. That's what they get for going over there chasing all the money. You will be stunned by the level of vitriol on this issue. And it's interesting, what you ought to do sometime is read some of the articles. Like, for example, Washington Post had a fascinating article recently about a private security contractor who was killed. And if you go to the chat pages, all it is people saying, kid got what he deserved, shouldn't have been there in the first place, profiteers and the like. But when I talk about contractors being killed, what are we really talking about? Is this a significant thing? Is it a little bit anecdotal? Well, first of all, there are now 3 contractors who have done work in Iraq who have lost more than 100 people in their organizations. Now, just out of curiosity, before I go any further, how many of you think you have a ballpark number for how many contractors have died in Iraq supporting the government? Okay, reasonably big number. But I mean, how many of you think you can get within 50% of what the number is? Ever read anything about it in the newspaper? No, it's not covered. Not covered anywhere. No newspaper larger than the Houston Chronicle has published statistics on contractor fatalities in the last 15 months. The public doesn't care, and the media won't report it. Okay, so let's go to the numbers. This is Faces of the Fallen from the Washington Post. Most recent numbers, 4865, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. So we've had over 4,850 total fatalities. Front page of the Washington Post. That totally excludes the fact that more than 1,350 contractors have died in Iraq. 1,350. In 2007, 1 out of every 4 bodies that came home in a bag or a box from Iraq on our side was a contractor. And you can't find that anywhere in the newspapers. All right, let's talk about, go ahead.
That figure is U.S., that's not including, let's say, like the Pakistanis, Indians that are in the trucks, the fuel trucks that have also been sources of targets?
All right, here's one of the interesting things about this. The problem with these numbers is that by any objective measure, first, it's low, but let me talk just for a second about how we get the numbers. Until a couple months ago, we only have these numbers because the Labor Department was keeping track. The Defense Department, until a couple months ago, has never kept track of dead contractors or wounded contractors. By the way, over 28,000 contractors have been wounded in Iraq. The Defense Department didn't think it was their job to keep track of them. while I'm saying things that'll probably offend people in the room, as a taxpayer, the single best economic investment you can make in the near future is having a contractor be injured instead of somebody in the military. If you have a member of the military standing here and a contractor standing next to them, and both of them have a leg blown off by an improvised explosive device, both of them will get the exact same medical care in theater. The moment they leave the theater, however, and return to the United States, the government has no responsibility for the contractors whatsoever. But going back to the point here, hands down, the most dangerous contractor job in Iraq is driving a truck. Most of those people are going to be locals working as contractors for the government. Now, some people say, but they're not Americans, who cares? Here's my point. Less than a generation ago, who was driving the truck? It used to be the people driving the truck were in uniform. We have drawn down the size of the military, so we have put contractors in the exact same roles that the military used to be in, so the contractors are in fact dying so that people in uniform aren't. Frankly, if you ask me, there's not that many things that are more inherently governmental than dying for your country. But let's take it one more step. Think about this in terms of representative democracy. If you talk to your neighbors, your friends, your spouses, or others, what are the metrics by which people judge military actions abroad? Most people only keep track of two numbers. How many troops do we have in theater, and how many troops have died? Both of these numbers are wildly deflated today due to our reliance on contractors. Remember, we may have had 190,000 troops in Iraq, but we had more than 190,000 contractors supporting them. Does that mean we should have had 350,000 people in the military there? Nobody knows what the exact numbers come out to, but the number of troops on the ground is wildly deflated because we have contractors there. And the same thing is true of fatalities and injuries. Many of the most dangerous jobs that aren't specifically trigger pullers are in fact being performed, and it's the contractors who are paying the price. Now, just to bring this full circle, I put this in the exact same category with casket photos. Now, I have no idea how you all respond to these types of things, but I grew up in a world, just as my parents grew up in a world, where you saw the human cost of military engagement abroad on the front pages of your newspapers or in the evening news by seeing photos of caskets. A generation before, people put gold stars in the windows of the family home. You can't find information anywhere on contractor fatalities because it's not public until very recently. But in addition, it's the same mentality that distorts what the public knows as we've suppressed casket photos. If you haven't followed this issue, the Bush administration made a decision that the photographers would no longer have access to the caskets returning to the United States. There was massive litigation under the Freedom of Information Act, and finally, the public advocacy groups won. And so thousands of casket photos were released. The Defense Department then, using the same kind of mentality, took what they believed was the appropriate step. They stopped photographing. So today, there are no more publicly available casket photos. So the question is, in a representative democracy, how are you to be exposed to what the costs are? You can't see the caskets, so you're not seeing the people in military. We've artificially reduced the number of military, and we've artificially reduced the number of fatalities, so the information the public has as to what our costs of war abroad are simply out of line with reality. All right, last thing on this, just to show you how cynical we can become. This document is the new, and it's not actually a status of forces agreement, but this is the new agreement between the United States of America and Iraq about the withdrawal of troops. It replaces the old status of forces agreement. The only thing that I want to mention about this document is that as a matter of policy, it is totally sold out the contractors. Under the new agreement, which is actually being delayed now for a number of reasons, but under this agreement, contractors are subject to the Iraqi judicial system. Now, interestingly enough, just a few months before the United States signed this document, the United Nations put out a great big report about all of the human rights violations in the Iraqi system to the extent that it exists. But here's the thing that I want you to think about. How can a nation that is so entirely dependent upon contractors to perform all of its tasks can send our contractors into a place like Iraq and tell them that we will not protect them in the same way that we will protect members of the United States military or the United States government? In any event, I've thrown a lot of things out there. I tried to save some time for questions. I hope I'll have some questions, and as you'll see, I have opinions on just about anything, so whatever you'd like to talk about is fine with me.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was great. You did cover a wide range, lots of good things, raised lots of issues. So I'm sure there will be some questions, and CP is eager.
Yes, I am. Isn't this a continuation of the same story going back to, let's say, just after World War I? Because here you're focusing on service contractors, but defense acquisition has a very similar experience in this regards, closing down ships, closing down shipyards, and then again converting those to private sector positions or pseudo-private and moving on from there. Is this the same story differently now?
I think it's a related story but different. So again, if we go back a couple of wars, in particular if we go back to World War II, again, what the government's buying is hardware. If you take almost any example, one of the historical strengths of the defense acquisition system was that it was, as these things go, reasonably competitive. So for example, Admiral Rickover, father of the nuclear navy, believed very strongly in dual sourcing. Okay? For anything he wanted, whether it was the metal benders or the people who were doing the nuclear cores, he wanted multiple competitors out there and he wanted them fighting for all of his contracts. That got him better quality, it got him better pricing, it got him better innovation. Decisions were made in the 80s and 90s to basically consolidate that defense base. My recollection is my colleague and friend here believes reasonably strongly in consolidating the defense base. I think there are many economic arguments for that, but at the end of the day, we're still talking about how are you going to inject competition, price competitiveness, innovation and the like into a manufacturing realm. What's totally different today, even though there was consolidation and drawdown, the reliance on service contractors is in fact a new phenomenon. We, for example, need all of these people to do tasks that the government used to do. So if you think about the hardware as a deliverable, the service is actually integrated into the basic fabric of how the government delivers its services. And because it's so unbelievably pervasive, there's nothing that the government really does anymore. I know that you had a speaker literally just last year who talked about the intelligence community, which has been outsourced pretty much as dramatically as almost any other industry. But it's a different animal simply because, if for no other reason, the senior managers in the government were never trained to manage contractors effectively.
So do you see this as a market failure analysis or a program management failure?
It's impossible to blame the program managers because they're stuck with the caps they got. I think that the big story here is the great myth of small government. Everybody wants to run on, I'm going to make government smaller even though the mandates increase.
I wanted to see if you could spin out a little bit more on the democratic responsibility point that you were bringing up earlier. I mean, because it seems that there's 2 points that are a little bit in tension, right? On the one hand, there's the idea that you were pointing out about contractor deaths and how the fact that those aren't publicized and the way the American people feel about those deaths undermines the government's responsibility for making decisions in war generally. It seemed to be part of what you were saying earlier. On the other hand, you might think that the reliance on contractors is also kind of part and parcel of democratic aims or desires of the people, right? They want a war in which people are less forced to go and sacrifice their lives and people are making decisions based on particular contracts.
And I may let you do more, but you just raised a couple good things, so let me get to those and then maybe you can take me further. So first, realistically, there is the convenience of not having the draft discussion. So we don't want to be responsible and we want to be able to project military might. Okay, so I think that's a terrific policy issue that needs to be taken into account anyway. The related one though, and this is why the information is so important, remember that in the campaign, most of the major candidates said, we're going to have fewer contractors. But they didn't say, we're going to provide fewer services or we're going to be less aggressive with the military. This is the disconnect. None of our politically elected officials have made the connection between the need to provide more services than the government we have can provide and the need to rely on contractors. But here, I think, is where the information is so important. There's no way for the public to intuit that disconnect. When the President of the United States says, I'm going to do the right thing for you and I'm going to reduce the number of contractors, that sounds good. But he's not saying, I'm going to provide less service to you as a taxpayer. I'm sorry I interrupted. Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, it's down that road. I'm just kind of wondering where it ends in a sense, because, if you're looking at this question as democratic responsibility, right? In the end, I'm trying to figure out how does it cut, right? Because if you have kind of the democratic will desiring no draft, desiring a lot of things that contractors provide, and at the same time also possessing a sort of pervasive mistrust of too much contractor reliance, right? I'm wondering if in the end, the use of contractors, if there's some sort of happy medium, or if the use of contractors in the end could be seen as either undercutting the democratic will because it doesn't allow the people to make these sorts of decisions as it relates to war and peace to the representatives, or if it essentially enacts democratic will by saying, we will abstain from the draft, we will have a less bloody war for American servicemen, et cetera, et cetera. And I say, wondering if you have an opinion either way.
I think your latter option is a far more optimistic conclusion than one I could ever get to. I mean, I think that, again, just like casket photos, I think that while the outsourcing decisions were not made as matters of policy, I think the tactical benefits of them to the administration, having the public not understand how big a military we would need to pursue the aims that are stated, or not having the public understand the cost of the efforts, I think that was advantageous to the administration, and frankly, I think it's shockingly cynical.
Is that okay if you move around the room?
Well, you haven't said much about the economics of all this, and obviously the cost of not having contractors originally was kept artificially low by the draft. But if you were going to have a system where you weren't dependent on contractors and were doing much the same as what you're doing now, how would the cost of that compare to the cost of contractors? In other words, the cost of getting enough people to be willing to serve in these.
Yeah, let me say a couple things on that. The first is, and I actually just finished an article on this last year, and I think it's maybe the most important point here. The economics aren't relevant because the government isn't big enough to fulfill the mandates which it's taken onto itself. So the issue isn't for the foreseeable future whether or not we should contract out. The issue is how effectively should we manage the contractors we have no choice but to rely on. So a decade, maybe a generation from now, the discussion that the issue you raised could be a very important one, but it is simply not relevant today because we are so totally dependent on contractors and we can't function without them. The other one, the economics of this are fascinating and the studies are all over the place. So for example, people are appalled to hear that it costs $200,000 to have one Blackwater private security person working in Iraq. Is that a lot of money or is it a bargain? Well, the defense experts would tell you it's pretty darn expensive to recruit and train and develop and maintain and ultimately sustain through retirement someone who's actually on active duty. So what I think the economics show is surge capacity is where you get the economic benefits. If we need 5,000 trigger pullers for a short period of time, it's much, much cheaper to pay outrageous sums of money to them to get them from the private sector and then be rid of them later. But if indeed we're going to hire tens of thousands of them and keep them for a long time, it makes great economic sense to build up the military. Then you get to the next issue of whether we need to change our military compensation so that we can attract sufficient numbers of people. This was a fascinating argument a year ago, but my understanding is right now is recruiting is going through the roof because as the economy implodes, it's a lot more attractive to have any job where they feed you 3 square meals a day.
Now, one other aspect of that, when Blackwater and other contractors were using primarily Navy SEALs and other well-trained, recently on active duty people, did the same thing happen there that seems to have happened in the intelligence community, where basically people left the service
Yeah.
in order to make a lot more money, and people left the CIA in order to
Right.
come right back in and do it as outsourced.
Right. At its
people
peak,
paying 3 times as much.
right. At its peak, the retention bonuses that were being offered to special forces soldiers in the military were extraordinary. So there was, in fact, a certain risk on that. But frankly, not all of that is attributable to the private security. I mean, another interesting analogy is the fact that we have a smaller military and we deploy them at a very high tempo now, satisfaction has dropped pretty dramatically. Just a couple years ago, for the first time in the modern era, the number of West Point graduates that did not stay on active duty for a second term dropped below 50% for the first time ever. We now have a hole in our junior to mid-officer corps in the Army, and that's something you can't fix overnight. That doesn't have anything, they're not going to work for Blackwater. They just want out because they're unhappy with the fact that we've stretched the Army so thin. So I think all of those things come into play.
My question is this, you presented a compelling set of expedients for why we've gotten to where we've gotten. We willy-nilly contract out inherently governmental functions. And if you look at contracting out across the civil government, federal, state, and local, it's clear that that's the case. There's a whole set of problems with that. You raised a whole set of issues with that. But I haven't heard, or do you think there's any argument that is going to change the direction in which we've been moving and the extent to which we're doing what we're doing?
To some extent, this goes back to the question earlier, but I think it's really important. I would love for there to be a meaningful debate or for there to be a public discourse as to what should be outsourced and to what extent we should be outsourced.
Who has a reason to motivate that debate, except for public employee unions?
Right. And their metrics and their aims are totally antithetical to the mission accomplishment aim, which drives a lot of this anyway.
So who's going to promote this debate? Who wants to have this debate?
I think that the short answer is, as a general rule, nobody wants to have the debate. The most interesting thing that's happened in the last few years is we're at least having the debate driven outside the country with regard to the use of private security. You know, we always talk in terms of the straw that breaks the camel's back, that really makes an issue percolate up in the public policy domain. The issue of interagency contracting and the fact that they weren't being managed, it was only when we found out that there were contractors in the middle of Abu Ghraib that all of a sudden that started getting reined in by the Defense Department.
I have a slightly related question.
Sure.
Blackwater, though, became so symbolic. The slaughter of civilians, and Blackwater stands for a lot of the things that we find wrong, even more than the KBR, Halliburton stuff.
Right.
Why did the Bureau of Consular Security, why did the State Department continue to ram Blackwater down our throats when it didn't have to?
You know, it's a fascinating question, but let me start with what you'll find the least pleasant answer. The State Department is ecstatic with Blackwater's performance, okay? If you bring in the senior people at Blackwater and you ask them what their metric was, how they were judged, they would tell you that when they went to Iraq, when there was a coalition provisional authority there, their job was to keep Ambassador Bremer and everybody else in his delegation alive, and they all came back. There's a reason why when Prince shows up on the Hill, he gets a standing ovation when he walks into the room, because every member of Congress who has been to Iraq and returned has had Blackwater security. When it's all said and done, the State Department has unbelievably high levels of customer satisfaction.
DynCorp could have done the same thing.
The
with
question
Blackwater people.
could have, okay? But at the end of the day, to some extent, State Department was showing you, I think, the backbone and spine that the Defense Department has failed to do. I personally find it appalling that the Defense Department has not defended KBR in the court of public opinion. The stuff that they've been accused of, they had a few people who did some very bad things. There's some bribery, there's a rape, there's some minor cost issues. I mean, but you're talking about staggering numbers of people in a hellacious environment, and if you've served in the military or if you have relatives in the military, when it's all said and done, those people have gone to hell, and they have served our people and taken better care of them than, honestly, than the Army has ever taken care of its own people. Last thing on this. I mentioned at the beginning, One of the fascinating things about contractors having the right to leave is how few did. If we look at the time we've been in Iraq, only one major contractor has pulled out of Iraq, and that was GE, and it was very, very early on. KBR has lost money, had near corporate disasters, lost over 100 humans over there, and has gotten nothing but bad press out of the whole thing, and they stayed. Frankly, I think the public owes them a debt of gratitude, and I find it criminal that the Defense Department won't make that representation to the public. I think it's totally irresponsible. Now, I'm not saying they don't make mistakes, but trust me, the reason we have the UCMJ is because the people in uniform make mistakes too.
Mark.
Thanks. Historically, it seems to me the way that overextended empires have managed their gaps between resources and commitments has been the use of locals. And it seems to me this is not exactly what you're talking about, but it's connected, no doubt, in all sorts of interesting ways. And I wonder if you could tell us something about what the trends are in terms of employment of locals or even third-party nationals. A reference was made earlier to Pakistani truck drivers and that sort of thing. Is there greater aversion now than there's been in the past to the use of non-Americans to perform these functions, or on the contrary, are there more than ever of that category as well working under the rubric of these contracts?
It's difficult at some level because you have apples to apples, but the point you make is a good one. The short answer is we have people hiring anybody and everybody over there. And particularly because there's so much tiering of subcontractors going on, you have everything. We have private security from every major armed nation on the planet. One of my favorite early lines from when one of my buddies came back from Iraq was the joke that everybody was telling is, what's one of the best things about a Gurkha? Well, a Gurkha will shoot anything that moves. What's one of the worst things about a Gurkha? Well, a Gurkha will shoot anything that moves. I mean, keep in mind that we have everybody involved there. And if, again, most dangerous job being the truck drivers, they're all local nationals. But I think the point's a really, really good one.
A couple of things. Even the right-wing, the libertarian-leaning folks, I think, say that national security is something that government should do, and I think that these support personnel should be included in that. The other thing is, I don't see why we can't get back to getting away from these contracts.
But don't you think it goes back, and now I forgot who asked the question, but in order to have a bigger military, you need people to serve.
Well, and that was the next thing I'm coming to. I've long thought we should have something like Israel, and when I heard something in the
Mandatory
campaign
service?
recently about more public service, and people were upset Bush didn't ask for any sacrifice. But they shouldn't all necessarily go to the military, but I think that there should be some kind of mandatory draft and public service stuff.
Yeah, I'm a lousy barometer on this. I spent my whole life in the Army. I lived in high school, and I went to high school in Germany where there was mandatory public service. I mean, frankly, if we're going to have a democracy, everybody's going to benefit. I think everybody ought to have some responsibilities as well. But I'm an incredibly sympathetic voice on that. The public has no interest in this debate, and there is no political will to even have the discussion anymore.
Well, among other people, I'll just offer a word on the other side. It's a complicated debate, and I don't want to really instigate this debate, but there are too many people in the United States. The problem is, even at the peak of the Vietnam War, in the year when we took the most people in the draft, we took 10% of the eligible people, right? And you got to ask yourself, what are you going to do with all these people if you force them into national service in the United States? And that gets to be a really complicated problem. So just how to pull it off, right? As opposed to volunteering the ones who want to do it, offering them a good deal to do it, allowing people to make their commitments to the nation through many different mechanisms, volunteering, paying taxes, who knows what. There are lots of opportunities.
Contractors or they're government employees, it's still, and a lot of these contractors, like the Gurkha thing you're talking about.
We need people.
They're cutting corners. The reason that it's more difficult for government employees is they have to pay attention to protecting human lives and do certain things according to law and not just shoot people.
Can I just offer you a quick anecdote? Just a quick anecdote on this, because we were talking a little bit earlier about Blackwater. One of my favorite moments, and I actually think that you were in the room when T.X. Hams was talking about this example. T.X. Hams, a former Marine, was teaching at National Defense University, but he offers the example about the fact that Blackwater will unequivocally say to you, we have done a perfect job on our contract because none of our people have been injured or killed. To which many senior government people respond, but the point of us being in Iraq is we were trying to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, which you don't do with black little bird helicopters buzzing people and driving down the middle of the road in SUVs and driving all the civilians off the road. But what Blackwater responds is, you could have written that contract, but that wasn't the contract you gave me. You gave me the contract, protect the ambassador, and that's exactly what I did.
So we'll take just a couple more quick questions because we're running late. So go ahead.
One of the outsourced things we've done in government is prisons. And one of the things that those companies have seemed to do is they got into the lobby business. And you haven't really talked about these companies lobbying Congress to continue their services or, I don't know, instigate wars or whatever it is they might do.
Tremendously important point, and historically there's no question that the lobbying and the money has a real big impact. But at least for the foreseeable future, I go back to the point that we're not doing what we're doing today because someone thinks it's a good idea. We're doing it because there's a shared mythology between our elected representatives and the public that small government, this misnomer, this what I like to call the great lie of small government, is attractive. And as long as we have expansionist mandates and we want to live by the myth of small government, we will continue to contract out. But I think the point you make is a great one.
So I want to give John the last quick question, and then
Okay.
we're a few minutes over. So.
Two comments with a question in the middle. Number one, if you've ever had Blackwater or somebody similar covering your back, you feel pretty good about those folks. And I've been there before, and I've been covered by our people, our government people, and other governments people.
And you prefer, right?
And I'll take the Blackwater guys because they have a level of expertise that we really can't provide except in very small numbers within the government.
Right, our people were never trained to do that.
Service, they have some very elite people who protect the president and the vice president, but your average Secret Service guy, you don't really want doing that job because that's not his main thing.
Good point.
These people are very, very good, and you have to understand that. And I think what he said was exactly right. We have bad contracting going on, and contracting is very difficult. The business side, I'm from the business school, by the way, the business side has been doing this now for 20 years and only now beginning to get it right. But the government side is still, exactly as you put on your slide, trying to contract like we're buying stuff, and you're not buying stuff. It's very, very hard to define this. We see businesses all the time doing what we refer to as contracting for error. They basically write a contract that says, I'm going to pay you and hope something happens.
Can I throw a quick one in and then
the
let you?
government stuff says the same thing.
This is a great.
Is there any likelihood of getting any change to that unless, amazingly, we outsource the contract?
I want to stay with the point that you mentioned about the business school because it's so important. The business schools, as I understand it, it was not so long ago in the business, and I'm not a business school type, but my understanding is that for a decade or more, the competitive advantage, the margins was all seen as how well you managed your IT, and today it's how well you manage your vendors and your supply chain. Well, that's outsourcing. But the government hasn't been trained. In the public policy schools, they're not teaching what you're teaching the private sector today in the business school, so they're not prepared. So I think that it's a huge, huge issue.
That's great. We invite you down to Strauss Center. It's the Strauss Center, not the public policy school. But you come and you tell us that we're causing all the problems, that we do a bad job. Well, thank you, Steve, for coming down. This was a great, really provocative talk, and thanks very much.